Welcome everyone to this, our second Pride in Procurement webinar. We are recording this event so that we can use it for training as we go forward. So if you do not wish to be filmed, please turn your camera off. You may also wish to change your name. This event will run slightly differently to the one in November because it includes a training element, including you being put into breakout rooms with other attendees. When you are there, please introduce yourselves. Before we start, just for your knowledge, I am Lucy Power. I am one of the co-chairs of the National LGBT+ Committee. Jen, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Jenny Antonio, and I'm co-chairing this evening, and I'm on the LGBT+ National Committee also.
Thank you. So before we start, I'll just run through some housekeeping. As an attendee, we ask you to mute yourself and only unmute yourself in the breakout room, or if you're reporting back to the main meeting later on. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and this session will finish no later than 8:30 p.m. Captions have also been provided for those who requested them in advance. If you did not request captions, but you need them, the link is posted in the chat. Please bear with us because there may be the occasional technical hiccup, but we will resolve to sort them out as quickly as possible.
And now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Gemma Friedman, Unison International Officer, Meg Lewis from Labour Behind the Label, Mitchell Coe, PSI LGBT+ Rights Campaign Officer at Public Services International, and Donna Rowe Merriman, Unison National Secretary for Business, Community and Environment. If you do have any questions about anything said during this session, please put them in the question box on your screen and we'll get to as many as possible. And now Gemma is our first speaker.
Thanks ever so much, Jen. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Here we are. So really delighted to be here this evening to launch Unison's exciting new second Pride in Procurement resource. It was born out of a July 2018 motion from which we got this project name. We started this, and why is this not going? Okay, sorry, give me 1 second to go into the slideshow, which is better. We started off with the first resource, which is a guide, and that sets the scene for the very challenging circumstances facing LGBT+ and other workers in global supply chains who are making Pride merchandise. It has inside a useful checklist for anyone sourcing merchandise, from Pride committees planning local celebrations to employers who are procuring rainbow lanyards. And it's really about helping you to start to think about change and setting the scene. The second resource, the one which we're launching today, is an extension of the first. It goes into more detail. It's about Pride committees developing a procurement policy, and it goes into more detail about why this is important and how to do it. It's a very practical guide to help to follow up on the policy, because it also offers tools and resources to help. It includes, for example, a template and also some, template policy, but also some template letters, one focusing on goods and one focusing on services. So this is pretty groundbreaking work. As far as we know, still nobody else has been doing it. And we owe a really big thanks to Meg Lewis at Labour Behind the Label for her sterling work, yet again, writing the text of this resource. So Meg was on holiday for the first webinar and we were all really disappointed, but we're really pleased that she can be with us here today. So in the first webinar, I which we will make sure that you can get access to in the future, I explained in more detail how this work fits in with the wider work of Unison in the international unit on global supply chains and procurement, and the purchasing power of the public sector itself to improve the lives of workers that make the products that we use at work. For those that didn't attend the first webinar, I'll just quickly run through that, just as a refresher, or for those that didn't attend. So when we think about it, what is the problem? Internationally, there are very, very few, if any, protections that exist for LGBT plus workers anywhere. In the developed north, there are more, and in some countries it's great, but in the majority of the world, it's hidden. It's not even allowed to come out to, let alone to ask for protections. And as annual Pride celebrations are rooted in a struggle for basic rights, it only makes sense that now that there is so much more behind the scenes of annual Pride celebrations, that we start to have a focus on those people who are helping to make Pride happen in such a beautiful way, yet they're hidden. So Pride events are associated with the rainbow flag and those merchandise, and yet, as I said, there are hidden workers who don't have visibility. So we want this resource to give them that visibility. There's severe exploitation of workers in the global garment supply chains, and Meg will talk more about this. But this exploitation, is in the face of multi-billion-pound brands. And one of the main reasons they have got to make all this profit is by driving down labour costs and labour standards, and that is exactly what is behind all of the merchandise, etc. So very few brands and retailers commit to any form of transparency to say exactly where they publish their supply chains. Exactly where they supply, they get their merchandise from, which factories, which factories, where are they, how many workers are in them, etc. They just don't want to say it. There's a few statistics down here about shocking statistics always about what's happening to LGBT plus people around the world. So why is this a unison issue? Ideologically, globalization is driven, as I've already alluded to, as you all know, to favour people, profit over people, and indeed the environment. We know that there are probably more than 16 million workers around the world who are enslaved in the private sector, and many of those, that is global supply chain workers. So it is impossible to say that if you are a brand or you're a retailer and you're selling any goods, or you're a supplier, that you don't have forced labour in your supply chain. And of the biggest 50 companies in the world in 2016, the International Trade Union Congress highlighted that well over 100 million of those workers were hidden, i.e. the global brands have a tiny number of workers, but there are 100 million that they don't want to take, more than that they don't want to take responsibility for, because it's contracting out and contracting out. And there are no binding rules internationally or in the UK that prevent this kind of corporate abuse to people and the planet. Actually, we're involved in a campaign at Unison modelled on to lobby and develop a law modelled on the existing Bribery Act to make it a civil and criminal offence to have failed to prevent abuse to people and the planet. So watch out for some things that will be coming up around that as well. The pink pound itself is worth around £6 billion each year. So what is happening here? Are we going back to the roots of solidarity, or is this just all about, capitalism and marketing and making profits? And Unison has always had a proud history of both equality and internationalism, and this is where we're bringing two of those together tonight. And of course, many Unison members sit on Pride committees. So the purchasing power of Pride, alone, it's the same principle. Alone, when you try and buy one thing alone, you don't have any power. But when you get together and you start placing bigger orders, that's collectively, that's where the power comes in. And actually, maybe in the future, we'll see pride committees getting together, you know, and talking together with the big employers and placing joint big orders, because actually I personally believe that consortium buying is the way forward, because that's where the power is. But we've got to start somewhere, and we can use that power to affect positive change and get those and decide to source from brands that are aligned to our values. So it's really, these guides are to encourage and support as much as possible. And within the first guide, there is a really, really good checklist. I won't, because of time, I won't go through all of them, but check it out. The second resource is focuses, as I said, on developing a policy. And this here, you probably can't see very much, but this here is the first page of that. It sets out, you know, the human rights in what the human rights ought to be in supply chains, before going on to stipulate particular clauses around both goods, products, whether it's garments or flags or whatever, and then another one around services. The first resource, we didn't focus too much on services, but given that we're a services union, we felt that we were compelled to make sure that we also included services when we actually got around to policy making. And then the second part, as I said, of the guide has quite a lot in it. It has a couple of really great templates, which targets prospective or current suppliers of goods, and the other one of services. So we really, really hope that we've made it much more easy, much more accessible. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do, but through this, we hope that we are helping to give you the tools and the confidence and knowledge to be able to start this. So I'll stop there. There is a page under key issues called Planning Pride, and both those resources are on there, and the webinars will go on there, so you can always go back to check on what we've said tonight as well. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Gemma. That was really interesting. And now to our next speaker, Meg Lewis.
Hi there. Is my microphone on?
Yes, it is.
Brilliant. Hi, so my name is Meg Lewis, and I am the Director of Campaigns for an NGO called Labour Behind the Label, and we are we're an NGO based in Bristol, which campaigns around garment workers' rights and amplifies the demands of garment workers in the global garment industry. And we're a member of the Clean Clothes campaign and work with trade unions and labour rights organisations across the world. So yeah, just wanted to firstly say thank you very much for having me today at this webinar, and also for giving LBL the opportunity to work on this piece of work, because it's something that is very important to us. So personally, this is very important to me. I've worked at LBL for 2 years now, but before that, my background was working in and volunteering for LGBT+ grassroots organising groups in the UK and abroad, most recently in Brighton and Hove. And yes, so I know sort of the constraints that LGBT+ groups often have around funding and around trying to make ethical decisions, often on quite tight budgets as charities or community groups, and really how useful these resources will be in order to help people to make those decisions and guide those decisions. So procurement is important across the board. This isn't something that's only important to Pride organisers or to LGBT+ groups, but there are some very specific issues. So brands are increasingly using greenwashing, or perhaps we should call it rainbow washing, tapping into social justice movements in order to profit from them, whilst glossing over and distracting from the human rights violations in their own supply chains. So this is an exciting opportunity for us as LGBT+ activists if we want to extend our values of queer solidarity, freedom, equality and justice throughout our supply chains to the workers, including LGBT+ workers who make our clothes and merchandise. And in this way, we can make a much bigger impact than just in our local communities. And it's a way of making sure that the work that we are doing in our local communities isn't complicit in a much wider system of exploitation. The resources like this are crucial to working from an intersectional approach. The garment industry in particular relies on systemic racism and gender inequality. The vast majority of garment workers in underpaid and exploitative labour are women of colour from the global south. And LGBT+ rights don't exist in a vacuum, and they interrelate and are interdependent with a whole raft of other human rights, including rights around freedom of association, freedom from forced or compulsory labour, and the right to earn a living wage to live in dignity. So with these resources, one of the things that we're hoping to do is to really start a conversation about, well, when brands are sharing their pride lines and t-shirts, talking about freedom to love, freedom to be yourself, these sorts of things, how much are they living their values in their business practices? Because that's incredibly important. They have a huge impact.
Thank you, Meg, for some really interesting insights there. We'll come back to you. And now to our next... Sorry? Now can we go to our next speaker, Donna Rowe Merriman.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name's Donna Rowe Merriman. I'm Unison's National Secretary, and I cover business and the environment and the community service groups. I've got quite a wide remit: bargaining support, health and safety, pensions are all an area that I work. But here I'm talking to you about one of the main areas of my work, which is about procurement. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you about this item. And I really can't commend the work highly enough for both the work that colleagues within Unison and also working with Labour Behind the Label have done in putting this excellent resource package together. Congratulations to you on what you've achieved. So what am I going to talk to you about? Well, organisations all have their own habits and ethos and cultures. And that's also the same for any Pride committee coordinating a Pride event. So as you know, we're here to talk about procurement, but we've already touched on it. What does that actually mean in terms of your Pride committee? And actually it boils down to ethical spending and the positive changes that together as a social movement, Pride committees can have both in the UK and across the globe. I'm sure we're going to go back to Meg and she'll talk about her areas, but I'm going to talk to you something a bit more closer to home that maybe is a little bit more visible. And that's the challenge that every organisation has when buying both goods and services to run a Pride event, and to do so in a way which is fully consistent with its own values. So Meg will talk again, I'm sure, about the global supply chain. But what ethical procurement impacts can Pride committees make here in the UK around items such as services? And what I mean by that is street cleaning, security services, some of the other things that will be procured by Pride committees to help their events run really well. Every organisation in the country with a budget has the power to begin making change. And we don't have to wait for that. That change can happen today. Not only directly, but through the decisions made through purchasing. Every organisation chooses how it uses its resources, however limited they are, as it buys what it needs. If you're involved in a Pride committee, then you have the power to effect significant social change right now through your purchasing decisions. Procurement decisions matter and how we procure services to support events can be done better and can be done ethically. Too many organisations don't realise that when they procure services such as street cleaning, security services, they are unwittingly outsourcing their values and responsibilities to others. Done badly, unethical procurement can cause serious reputational damage. The key risk is that with an organisation might find themselves buying a service that's being delivered by a third party in a way which is seriously out of step with both their own standards of behaviour, their ethos and their culture. There are some key questions that I think are in the document that should be asked in these situations by pride committees. First of all, fundamentally, what wages are workers being paid? Do they receive the real living wage? Today, it's estimated that 5 million workers in the UK still earn less than the real living wage. And that's the first and most obvious question, to ensure that your service provider pays the foundation real living wage, to ascertain what the service deliverers are going to actually receive. And that's not the government's national minimum wage, which was rebranded. It's not that, because that's not actually high enough for someone to live on. That is in fact still a poverty wage, a wage that would leave even the average full-time worker living in in-work poverty. Over the last 20 years, the living wage movement in the UK has developed a well-researched, evidenced and independently calculated hourly wage, which is based on the cost of living. It is set each year at a level which would enable someone to live above the poverty line. Today, the living wage in the UK is £9.50 an hour, or £10.85 an hour in Greater London, and that's significantly higher than the government's minimum wage, particularly in London, where the real living wage is 23% higher. It's nearly a quarter above the government's national living wage. Currently, over 6,000 employers, businesses, charities and the public sector have already voluntarily signed up to become living wage employers, publicly agreeing to always pay the living wage to their employees and also every supplier. KPMG have recently estimated that 1 in 5 jobs in the UK still pay less than the living wage, and that's over 5 million jobs, as I've said. But the reason I'm mentioning this at length is that in some sectors, including facilities management, covering areas like cleaning and security, the minimum wage, the lowest level, remains prevalent. In the cleaning sector in 2020, it was estimated that 60% of workers still earn less than the real living wage. So for pride committees, what you need to consider is your service provider who's going to do your street cleaning, your service provider who's going to provide security services to any large scale event. Are they relying on the minimum wage to pay their workers? Are their workers delivering the service to you actually living below the poverty line? Is that consistent with your organisation's values? The Low Pay Commission has estimated 1 in 5 cleaners in the UK who are entitled to the minimum wage were actually being paid less than this by their employer. Now, there are still people who are operating below the law, below the legal minimum requirement. But what somebody's paid is only part of the issue, because it's really important to look at the second area and what's their employment status. The hourly wage is only one factor driving a worker's employment experience. Their other is the employment conditions that they are actually working under, and in some ways they are just as important as what somebody is paid. Employed workers benefit from more protections, things like paid sick leave, for example, as well as having a more predictable income. Some contractors, specifically in areas like cleaning and security, will employ people on 0 hours contracts. And that means that individuals have much more precarious employment and form part of what's colloquially known as the gig economy. They will potentially have less access to training, development, and less connection to the organisation that they are working for. All of these modes of employment are, of course, entirely legal, and each may have its place in some circumstances. Not many, I would ascertain. The question, though, for pride committees is to determine whether that matches your expectations of the quality of service that you will be seeking to provide. While it's not unlawful, I put to you tonight, they are unethical. They can be used to drive down costs to the detriment of the worker themselves. A self-employed worker in the gig economy is not entitled to paid holidays or paid sick leave or pension contributions. They just get paid for the hours they work and nothing more. A worker on a 0 hours contract is employed, but is not guaranteed a set number of hours or a set income, and their hours can often be varied at very short notice, sometimes on the day itself. An employed worker on a standard employment contract will have both regular hours and predictable income, as well as paid holidays, sick leave and pensions contributions. All of these are legal and used by many employers in the UK today, particularly those providing facilities management and security services. The challenge is to ensure that anyone on your Pride Committee is commissioning a service does so with their eyes open, ensuring that they are aware of the employment mode that is being used to deliver the service for their event, and that sits with the organisation's values. And it's worth bearing in mind that for low paid occupations like cleaners and security workers, their income may be too low to even allow the build-up of savings. And that means they can afford few holidays in practice and may have a strong incentive to continue working even when sick. And at the present time, as we all know particularly, continue to work well and well can pose a significant organisational risk to an event. For lower paid work, such as precarious income, can leave workers and their households dipping in and out of income poverty if they do not have savings to rely upon, and many just don't. Universal credit isn't helpful. It has substantial challenges, even at the best of times, to try and navigate, and that's even more challenging if your income is erratic and fluctuates. For workers in low pay occupations, therefore, their hourly rate is a really important factor for them and their families, and something that we would urge Pride committees to really consider. But let's look at a third thing. What are their terms and conditions, particularly sick pay, holidays and pensions? The statutory minimum employment conditions allowed by law are very low in these areas, and we've seen that this can have risks to events and to reputational damage. SSP is the least amount of support which employers are obliged to offer anybody who's sick to their employees, and it's a very low threshold of support. And during the pandemic, it was quite clear that some workers felt compelled to keep working even if they had coronavirus, which is incredibly dangerous for them and the people they were meeting at work or on public transport getting to work. And we just say, why did they do it? It's because they simply couldn't afford to stop working. The two other statutory terms and conditions that I mentioned are pension contributions and holidays. Well, if you can't save money for a holiday, you're unlikely to be able to save money for your retirement and a pension. It seems highly unlikely that a responsible employer in the UK should be relying on the absolute minimum employment conditions allowed by law, but they are. But such an approach is often really consistent with an attitude that seeks to pay people as little as they can get away with. Well, if that's one thing, what else are they trying to get away with? And Pride committees really need to consider, is this the kind of company you want to trust your organisation's reputation with? It's important to understand the key terms and conditions because it tells you a lot about the company and its attitude towards its own people. A sign that a provider genuinely cares about its social and environmental impact will be the extent to which it's reviewed its own supply chain so that it purchases goods and services in an ethical way. But there's nothing wrong in asking, well, what evidence or examples can they provide you to show that they do this? Procurement may be done with the best of intentions, but it can still lead to a significant risk to reputation and resultant damage. And if you're commissioning a service from a third party and they are delivering it in your name, perhaps even on your premises, and it is entirely paid for by you, then you are absolutely fully entitled to ask them how they operate. Some suppliers could be very reticent to share this information with you, even when asked directly, and such responses should set alarm bells ringing. Any employer with decent standards will be very proud of how they treat their staff and very happy to share the information about their terms and conditions, not personal or confidential information. The companies which are coy about their employment practices are usually the ones with the most to hide, in my opinion. In some sectors, driving down wages and the accompanying terms and conditions has been a primary tactic in managing costs for large multinational corporations, keeping their prices competitive. Their prices are not low because of efficiencies or of innovation, but because they've just cut labour costs to the absolute minimum. Suppliers may be operating within the law, but as I'm sure you'll know, that's a relatively low threshold. So I ask everyone on this meeting tonight, let us commit to a new resolution to intentionally use our purchasing and outsourcing decisions to make our Pride events a much fairer and better place, because we're using this opportunity to set out why outsourcing matters so much and how it can be done better, and how the challenges you consider as a Pride committee and your organising committee will help to ensure that delivering a Pride event is ensuring that the workers helping to deliver that event are also treated with dignity and respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Donna. That was really, really impactful. I think you've made some really powerful points there. We're very fortunate to have Meg able to join us again, so I am going to pass over to Meg to finish up her points.
Hi again, and I'm very sorry to deliver my message in two parts. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the internet behaves this time. I just wanted to finish sort of talking about why this resource is very important. So unfortunately, it is not enough to take brands or retailers' word on whether or not their products are ethical or sustainable. So when products or garments are unrealistically cheap, it gives a good indication that labour costs are not being paid fairly. But unfortunately, you can't tell, because a lot of the time, much more expensive retailers or brands will be using the same factories. Those workers will get paid the same amount. So it's not an indication if something is more expensive that necessarily the workers are getting paid more. Many of the brands claiming to be ethical don't even mention labour rights or how much their workers are paid. I'm still surprised, and I shouldn't be, by the number of times I will look up a brand claiming to be ethical, only to see that, you know, they've got one very specific line, or they've got one very specific commitment, often to do around recycled materials, or the recyclability of their garments, rather than anything to do with the workers who make those clothes. So the words sustainable and ethical are very big words that are very loaded, and they mean a lot, but often brands and retailers will not take all of that into account. So they rely on the fact that people will see those words and think, okay, great, I can feel happy about buying this. But this resource gives very tangible questions that activists and Pride committees can ask to unpick some of those mysteries. A lot of the information around procurement can be incredibly complex and inaccessible for community groups or for organisations, for individuals. It can be really hard to get the information that you need in order to make an informed decision. On the other hand, sometimes information about procurement will be simplified to the extent where it really limits the impact of actions or guidelines, because in order to deliver it in a very simplified way, you lose a lot of the context, and you lose a lot of the information that really helps you to make a difference. So we've tried with these resources to create a middle ground and give practical support to community groups and Pride committees in order to make a difference, and to really include the important points that you need to consider, but by giving things like the letter as well and the letter template, hopefully we can make it an easier way for people to put this into practice. So at Labour Behind the Label, we know that in order to change the garment industry for the well-being and livelihoods of workers, we need collective action. We need individuals on board, we need community groups on board, we need public services and local government on board. If we all start making changes to our own procurement processes and the way that we buy things, and start to ask the questions in whatever capacity that is, so either as an individual asking questions on social media, brands and retailers, or community groups asking questions when they're procuring merchandise, slowly these questions will start to unpick supply chains and uncover supply chains and get rid of all this sort of secrecy that hides exploitation, illegal pay in supply chains, and then we can start to make things change.
Thank you very much, Meg. That was really, really good and not diluted at all by the two-part delivery. So our final speaker then is Mitchell Coe. If I can hand over to you, Mitchell.
Thanks, Lucy. Hi, everyone. My name is Mitchell, and I'm from Public Services International. And for those that don't know who we are the Global Union Federation for all public service unions around the globe. Not only that, I'm also the coordinator of the Council of Global Unions LGBT+ working group. It was a working group established specifically to look at LGBT+ rights and how we work together as global unions to improve LGBT+ rights at a global union level. And I just wanted to say what a wonderful resource this is, and a big congratulations to Unison for such a fantastic resource, and also to Meg. I know she's put in quite a lot of work into this. From my perspective, it's quite a unique trade union resource, and I'm going to be sharing it a lot with my global union comrades and other PSI affiliates, because I think they can learn a lot from such a resource. And I also think that this directly relates to what we're trying to build as global unions, which is solidarity between LGBT+ workers and their allies. And from my view at a global union level, and again, highlighting what Gemma said in her presentation, acts of solidarity by workers have had a huge impact for some of the most marginalized and exploited workers in the world. And we've seen this through solidarity efforts with the devastating Rana Plaza disaster, where international worker solidarity was important to pressuring the Bangladeshi government to improve labour standards, and founded the Bangladesh Accord for Fire and Building Safety, which is an amazing achievement from such a disaster. I think it's important to note that local efforts such as ethical procurement of Pride merch, does have a major impact on global workers' rights. And only unions are present all along the supply chains and active in the movements across the world, meaning that we truly do have a unique opportunity and responsibility to push for greater LGBT+ rights for workers. And from my perspective also, that's what we're going to be doing in our next phase of work at a global union level. We'll be working hard to promote solidarity at a global union level. And one of the ways that we're going to be doing this is by creating a standard clause and policy to be inserted into global framework agreements to help protect LGBT plus workers' rights in countries where they have limited or no rights at all. And looking at ways in which international LGBT plus workers, such as transport workers, airline personnel, border workers, where they cross into countries where it's illegal to be themselves, global unions are going to be focused on how we protect those rights. You know, because their protection in global agreements is just so important. And as Meg said, we can't just trust companies to keep to their word on, you know, ensuring LGBT rights and workers' rights. We must ensure compliance with global framework agreements for companies that want to supply Pride events in the UK. And unions are protecting workers across the planet and all along the supply chains when they do this. So my section was short and brief, but again, congrats on this resource. It's fantastic, and I really can't wait to share it on our website, lgbtiworkers.org. So thank you.
Thank you, Mitchell. That was really, really interesting. So we've heard from all of our speakers now, and they've raised so many things that need some real reflection. But this is not just about being talked at, it's about practical action. So now we are going to break out into rooms so that we can talk about how we can approach Pride organising committees. Each room is going to have slightly different questions, and when we come back together, we'll ask for a volunteer to feed back from each room. So please give some consideration when you go in, who will be taking notes and who will be feeding back. So I imagine that you'll all be disappearing off around now.
It's all very challenging for me, this technology. So let's have a go. See if we can do it that way. So, over to you, Jackie.
Could you make the writing a bit bigger, please?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think I can. I'm not sure I can, Jackie. I'm so sorry.
Smaller.
So start like so.
So let's have a go. No, I don't think.
All right, no, that's better. That's better. Right. So our group was slightly skewed because there were three officers and myself and Penny, who are the co-chairs of the national our international subcommittee, so actually have been doing a lot of work around this. So if you like, the questions, we could not talk from our own experience of being involved in or raising the Pride Committee for different reasons. But we had, I'm just doing my best here, some of the things was that these are the things we think will come up, are likely to come up. So, you know, they've got not a lot of money, and certainly the small prides have not got a lot of money, that some will be frightened of speaking. There'll be some concerns from some of our members about speaking, going along to a Pride committee and having this discussion with them. But we did think that the toolkit hopefully will achieve its aim of helping to the people start that conversation. We think Pride committees, small or large actually, will probably say, oh, this is an awful lot of work, how on earth are we going to manage this? So the toolkit is to help with that. And the last point, how did it help? Blah, blah, blah. We were talking about how that question might, the others, the counter side of that question might well come. Well, why aren't we, for example, not buying T-shirts from Poland? And what we were talking about was how, if you like, part of our role is to try and get people to look at things from the other end of the telescope, which is not, it's about the conditions people are working under, rather than the country they happen to live, if I can put it like that. And yes, and very briefly, because I'm sure I'll get told I've got to stop a minute, we actually had a very interesting conversation a little bit about how we might, how can I put it, work on making sure this is implemented, the things what we are talking about buying, implemented ourselves within Unison, because many regional groups actually buy their own stuff from a budget of some kind at regional level. So we had some ideas about how we might, how can I put it, try and make sure, both from the regional groups end and also from HQ end, about how we might try and make sure that the message gets through to whoever it is who's involved in making those purchasing decisions. And then the final thing, which I think is quite important, is we also had an idea that we should at least look at trying to collect information on possibly good providers or preferred providers, which might help all right. Donna, have I missed anything, do you think?
No, I think you've covered everything. That's great. That's great. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you. And now can we have feedback from the second room? That was the one that Meg was in. I don't know who's feeding back.
Yeah, I think we're going to do a bit of a joint effort. But yeah, we had some really good discussions initially about how the resources are sort of going in the right direction, and it's something that we should all be considering. We also had discussions around I suppose a potential barrier or concern for pride committees is that many pride committees are operating on very slim margins and might be worried about turning money down, because we talked about sort of sponsoring and having corporate sponsorship or corporate partnerships with clothing brands, for instance. And I'm hoping that Darian's going to share a really good example that we talked about.
Yeah, no, it's not from a pride angle, but it's from corporate sponsorship angle. So what I was saying is I have a different hat as well, because I'm co-chair of ILGA Europe, which works across 54 countries in Europe and Central Asia, and we have a funding manager who goes and which a lot of huge organizations want to give us money to do good things, to brand themselves. So Wrangler approached us a couple of years ago, and they've got fantastic wealth and a number of different brands, including Levi's, etc., etc. And they wanted to give us money. So we decided, well, the board decided to do a protocol to ensure that that we would only accept ethical money, if you like, which is I know a very broad statement and doesn't always work, but as best as we can, because we wanted to follow the supply chains back. I'm really sorry, but I'm in the garden because I've been on this all day since 3:30. My neighbours just come out to start banging. Sorry, but anyway, so we looked at all their policies, their diversity policies, their LGBTI inclusion policies, which were fantastic, and they are really fantastic. But then we followed some of the supply chains back, and one of the big factories is in Lesotho in Southern Africa. And we, in the international arena, would know exactly what the penalties are for being an LGBTI in Lesotho are, let alone being on the gig economy. So we went back to Wrangler and actually refused their very generous offer of funding. And they were really shocked and surprised by that. But they accepted our recommendations, and instead of pulling out of Lesotho, which is not what we wanted them to do, but we wanted them to install their ethos, if you like, into their supply chains. So what they did was they went back and they have got now a diversity policy in Lesotho. It's not LGBTI necessarily friendly, but they have a diversity policy which they are trying to uphold. And we have now, because they've reached the threshold of whatever 60% of our criteria, we now will accept some of their money. So it's about that. But we were surprised that they were surprised we refused them, A, and B, we were really surprised that they came back with more money for us, having done something. So there is this real desire, I feel, that if you can work in a collaborative way, yes, nobody's perfect, but if there's a big give and take and time to change, we can change together. So that was just an example I was giving, and it's a true example, and it's I think a really positive example. Yeah.
Thank you, Darian, for helping feedback that. I think it was just great hearing it from you. Yeah, and that was really sort of what we talked about. We also talked about the importance of having those incremental changes, how it would be very difficult to demand everything that's in the policy all at once because of the low level of conditions in the garment industry and the very low levels of wages. So we talked about the fact that the policy could be used to work with suppliers and really sort of have an action plan of how to raise standards within the supply chain.
Oh, thank you, Meg. And finally, let's hear back from the third room. That's the one Mitchell was in and I was in, and I know Adam is feeding back.
Yep, okay, so our questions were around how we'd use the resources that have been developed and how we take them to Pride committees. And we kind of started out with a little bit of a scene setting, kind of talked about the Pride events and what relationships we have with them. And I think what we found was certainly for smaller Pride events, we tend to have decent relationships, or at least we tend to know people that are on Pride committees. Whereas with some of the larger Pride events, and in particular Manchester Pride and London Pride kind of jumped out of us, we don't really have that relationship with them. And so the approach that we'd be taking with them would probably look a little bit differently. We talked around how we could, one, approach them. So finding out people who are actually on Pride committees or whether we've got those relationships already, whether they hold any open meetings or whether they hold any AGMs, and whether we'd be able to take stuff to them. And particularly for the larger ones, so Manchester Pride, I'll pick on, for example, we thought that because we didn't have a relationship with them in particular, if we wanted to get them to adopt this kind of policy, we might need to take a slightly more adversarial approach with them. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but I mean doing what we do, that campaigning, sharing posts on social media, writing to them, getting other people to support what we're asking for them to do, and being able to build kind of a bit of groundswell behind that to be able to take kind of this policy to them and getting them to consider some of that. Whereas with more local Pride events where we know people, so again, from my region, I pick somewhere like Liverpool Pride, I'd be almost confident saying that we could just sit down with them and have a conversation and actually then talk around what can we do as Unison to support them. So one of the suggestions from the presentation earlier was around linking in with local organisations. So it could be, for example, using local councils to actually do the procurement for them, where we can then, because we're the largest trade union in those councils, look at the council's procurement policies and ensure that they're inclusive and ethical ones, and therefore when their Pride events are procuring through them, then their procurement will also be ethical and procure. And we're also around looking at a lot of our members of the people that they are procuring, particularly via street cleaning services, particularly via kind of other kind of facilities, so security management, that kind of ones could well be coming through councils and therefore through our members. One of the other things that was mentioned is that Bernardo's actually has an ethical procurement charter mark, which is something that Unison through this could consider taking forward in a way that we could almost give people an award for having a particular policy or a particular way of doing procurement as almost a status, as almost getting something out of that, which may be something that then is attractive for certainly some of the large Pride events, but also maybe even some of the smaller Pride events as well, particularly where their values are sat in doing that kind of ethical work, that kind of, I guess, what we call green activism, that kind of work would sit comfortably with them. So I hope that's a reasonable summary of what we discussed, but if anyone else wants to pitch in.
No, that's absolutely perfect. Thank you, Adam. So thank you everyone for all of your contributions, really, really helpful discussions, some great points that have been raised, and we've now reached the end of our session. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to Gemma, Meg, Donna and Mitchell for giving up their time to be with us today and sharing their thoughts and experiences and knowledge with us, and also to you for participating in such a wholehearted way. As we said when we launched our first resource, Pride and Procurement is a brilliant resource, and this second resource will help us and give us all the tools to have the confidence to approach our local pride organising committees, to ask those questions that need to be asked about their procurement and their business. So I'd like to thank you all for attending, and good night.